Okay, give him your attention, please. Anytime you're ready.
War is never a lasting solution for peace. This is a quote from APJ Abdul Kalam, the 11th President of India.
Now, while war has many problems, the major one that we've decided to focus on today is how war halts development.
So, war causes the loss of culture, ethics, and art. The battlefield is filled with destruction. The destruction of an environment and atmosphere of a once peaceful place. The destruction of important historical sites and artifacts. The destruction of people's relationships and their worldviews. War causes massive destruction. The Marshall Plan, which aimed at rebuilding Europe after World War II, was estimated to cost around $50 billion. And just that for inflation now, and that is $331 billion spent on European reformations alone. So, money that could have been spent on the bettering of our public facility, the bettering of medication in the medical field, on the bettering of our community, was spent on the consequences of war. And that's just dipping our toe into the economic lens of it, but today we will be going over the artistic, social, and ethical lens.
War and art are polar opposites in humanity. War can affect the development of art through the destruction of museums and personal property. Throughout nearly every war that goes near a city, museums are ravaged, paintings are destroyed, sculptures defaced, and vital parts of the arts and humanities are lost. Although war may destroy some paintings, it also inspires art that explains the events that took place, such as George Washington crossing the Delaware River, shown here. This was painted in 1851. War can also contribute to the development of art programs, such as the War Art Program that was created in 1943 to create revenue for the war effort. This program was later discontinued a couple years later and made a mockery of in Congress. In the philosophical department, however, Sun Tzu's The Art of War is one of the most influential books in military history. This has been applied to more aspects of life than just war, including sports and business.
So for the social effects of war, so the battlefield itself is comparable to hell. In the Vietnam War alone, 15% of veterans are said to have suffered some degree of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. PTSD can cause social interactions to diminish as they feel that they are different and an outcast from other people as they do not share the same views as them. And war can also tear families apart. Parents away from their kids and kids away from their family and from their parents allows distance to grow between them, allowing emotions such as sadness, anger, or hurt to fester. And in some cases, children may suffer from secondary traumatization, which is a milder version of PTSD. When children suffer from secondary traumatization, they are prone to anxiousness, depression, and to be emotionally distressed. This can cause problems in their social interactions, which may halt their own personal development. The children may become shut-ins and won't contribute anything to society. Lastly, we have racism, and war causes an us versus them mentality. And once we become closed-minded towards a different culture, we won't be able to grow as an individual, thus stunting our growth in our journey of life.
Now, it's no secret that war has a huge ethical debate, whether it be for things like the war crimes or the Geneva Conventions. There are many different ethical aspects of war, and with that comes the ethical aspects of how war halts development. In most cases with war comes the destructions of lands and towns because of things like urban warfare. Afterwards, following the war, the cost to repair these buildings such as home could be expensive, costing money and supplies, which can halt the economy for some time depending on the amount of damage that's been done. And of course, with war comes the destructions of lives, which also falls into my next point, the death of innocents. With the death of civilians through urban warfare comes the destruction of society with things like job loss, which can further halt the economy since there's less jobs to be worked. Before 1954, when pillaging and plundering were considered war crimes, militaries would often go to different towns to plunder and or pillage for supplies such as food and tools, which would then often end in destruction of the town. And then finally, there's torture. And as Ariel previously stated, 15% of Vietnam soldiers experienced some sort of PTSD. And the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, or the BBR Foundation, state that PTSD can cause excessive nightmares and frightening thoughts, depression, lost interest in past activities, and they become emotionally numb. And there are many more symptoms that PTSD can cause. And while PTSD may not cause any physical halt, it definitely causes mental halt and greatly affects someone's mental health.
So one potential solution is that the United Nations pay the reparations of war. As the United Nations would be paying for the war damages, they would encourage more peaceful and diplomatic ways to resolve conflicts. And countries wouldn't have to worry about an economic collapse or failure after a war, as they would have the backing of the United Nations. This would allow them to focus more on the development of their country. Although the United reparations are good for those that participate in the war, it won't be for the United Nations, as the damages of warfare are very costly, which may cause some development issues for countries in the United Nations. Consequences could include higher taxation or inflation. And as the United Nations pay for the damages, they would have to allocate the capital and resources, making them more vulnerable and weak.
For our second potential solution, we figured that we could find different ways to settle disputes. Instead of fighting wars in real life, we could use virtual reality or some sort of duel instead of mass destruction of land and property and large death rates. And with militaries already using their VR for training, and as technology advances every day, VR may already be a possibility in the future. With things like VR war, it would definitely be a lot more safer since we're not physically killing people and destroying land. There would also be less diplomatic destruction. While there's a lot of destruction within the battlefield, there's also destruction between governments. A good example of this is the US and Russia after the Cold War. While Russia was significantly weakened by the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the US was able to flourish and maintain themselves. With things like VR, things like this wouldn't even happen since nothing is truly being destroyed. However, not everyone may agree with these solutions since there are so many pro-war activists out there, as well as society may become too sensitive since no one will get hurt and no one will actually see how hard life truly is as we become too attached to technology.
Our solution is to implement stricter laws of war, such as artillery and bombs, as well as more laws for engagement in heavily populated areas. These laws would allow the development of art to persist in wartime, as well as reduce death and stress on civilians. This would keep societal and ethical development at a premium, and it would also reduce the cost of war significantly. This would make war much more of a strategic action rather than a numbers game, more like chess than like Risk. As good as this sounds on paper, however, it has some realistic limitations that need to be addressed.
The first limitation of stricter laws of war would be the agreement of the laws. Every country has their own political views and agendas which may not align with the laws. This could cause disputes between countries, allowing for more potential problems to arise.
For these said laws, how do we actually enforce it and decide who enforces it? How do we decide what country has the right to enforce these laws more than others and how they're actually broken? Also, how much would the cost actually be to implement these laws and their punishments? I mean, dependent on the law and punishment, their implementation could be expensive, and the time it takes to implement these laws could take a really long time.
The last limitation for this solution is a major problem. How would countries and the UN designate no-fire zones and DMZs, or demilitarized areas? If they weigh every life equally, then how would it be fair to make a city such as Portland safe, while a city such as our hometown of Las Vegas might be fair game? They have similar populations and are both located on the West Coast. So how would you decide which city should be designated a no-fire zone?
War causes a multitude of problems in the development of a country. There are different ways to resolve this problem, but stricter laws of war is the most practical way of the three solutions presented. And although it may have its limitation, it has the potential to become a reality. It is the most realistic solution to solving the problems of war halting development. Thank you.
Okay. Jackson, describe how the content of the team presentation was changed as a result of group discussion.
So the content of our presentation kind of changed as a result of group discussion, because originally we were just going to do the effects of war on society, but then we kind of narrowed it down to development. So not just like, say, like it wasn't just, you know, war kills people. It wasn't just war destroys stuff. It was war. It changes the way people think. It changes the way people develop society themselves, and that was a really huge part of the presentation.
Ed, having finished your project, what, if anything, do you consider to be a gap in your team's research that, if addressed, would make you feel more confident about your conclusion?
Well, I feel as if we addressed the present laws of war that we have now, and during war, if they're broken, what what that has led to in the events of history, how would those things have changed if we have implemented these stricter laws of war in the past, and how that would have altered history and how we live now today?
Ariel, how did the group decide to include Ed's perspective, lens, or conclusions into the overall presentation?
So as you saw in the PowerPoint, we decided to include Ed's lens, the ethical lens, into the presentation, as we thought that it would give more time to our presentation, and also we needed to bulk up our information, as Ed's paper discussed more on how we decided to research more on the ethical lens, as Ed's paper focused more on the positive effects of ethical. So we decided to add more the negative effects, so we can prove our point of how it halts development.
All right. Good job.